board meeting of April 1st. Look like it outside, it's snowing. So the only thing on the agenda today is the short-term rental bylaw. We wanted to call a meeting to get this passed and pushed onto the planning board so they can have their public meeting. So any comments from the board?
No.
No, I look at, I think, my general take is that, we're gonna do a good job, with well-behaved operators.
Of course we are.
And we are gonna have we may have a challenge with folks who use the law to skirt regulation as we talked about. And I think what we should do is take a look at this in a year and see if it's strong enough to ensure that if we have problem operators that we can enforce our rules, without them starting new companies or doing whatever they're gonna do. And my only other comment is that if we drop somewhere in the 550 to 600 residences in this town area, we're about 650 now, according to Michael. If we get down by another 100 in our term, or at least in my term, I'm going to try to bring back up the question of whether we want to protect residential home ownership in this town. And I don't think we have to do it now, but I do think that, if we see a trend line where residences are dropping and continue to drop, my position is going to be that we need to make sure that we can defend the residential character of the town. So, but I think that for what we're trying to do here, which is to add some ability for our town committees and boards and departments to regulate, I'm comfortable where we are.
Okay. Any comments from the public?
Yes, this is Steve Stern. I'd like to make one, I have a comment and a suggestion. So we'll start with the suggestion. With the proposed bylaw, section 2.5. Tell me when you're with me. Is that up there? Yes. It states that events that include tents or amplified music or which customarily require a license or permit are not allowed. I would like to suggest not adding or subtracting words, but changing the order. I would like to just have that sentence read: tents or amplified music or events which would include customarily require a license or permit are not allowed. The point of it being that if a short-term rental is coming in, there should be no tents, there should be no amplified music, and things that require a license or permit. I didn't want it to be hazy in the definition of what is an event and what is not an event.
Michael, you want to?
You want to respond to that, Mike, or you want one of us to?
Yeah, so the wording as we have it right now is that we are not allowing anything that would require a license or permit. But by changing it to tents or amplified music, if there wasn't a requirement for a permit, it would be restricting a residential use, which is allowed. So just like any other residential house, they would be allowed to have amplified music, and you could rent a small tent. I believe it's under 10 by 10 with no permit or anything else. So if there is no permitting requirement or anything else, restricting it is questionable.
I have a question on this. So basically to answer Steve's question though, that Steve, it's our understanding that because, folks, residences are allowed to play music at their homes, and they're allowed to have people outdoors, and if it's raining, people outdoors under a cover, that we can't go further than what restrictions you could place on a residence, because short-term rentals are residential properties. And so we're not allowed to distinguish, I guess is the word, between what we can do to a normal residence and what we can do to an Airbnb or to a short-term rental.
We can't overstep our legal boundaries.
I do think it raises the question. I mean, in the draft of the cottage era bylaw that's being proposed, folks can do 175 person events by right. And that does raise the question of many of those are now currently short-term rentals, like, you know, Taggart House and whatever. I'm not beating up on them. George and Caitlin are great people. But one thing we should bear in mind is that some of these bylaws may have to interact, and there may be some unintended consequences of some of the proposals on the table here.
Yeah, well, we'll have to work them out.
Yeah.
Well, for right now, I know that I'm quite sure that to have an event, obviously, and with a tent, you do have to have a permit. You can't just go, oh.
Yeah.
And I think there's a restriction that it has to be someone in your family. I mean, there has to be some familial in a residential area. I think there has to be a familial connection. Now, people can lie. On the other hand, it still requires a permit.
I think the main thing about this one is, in general, we can't restrict the amplified music during
Right.
certain hours of the day.
Like you
And
said,
then
10 by 10.
a 10 by 10 tent is actually, there's no permit, no nothing required, so they're not required to come in and do that.
And if the music's too loud, then you have your regular avenues of calling the police and reporting a noise complaint and stuff. So just like any other residential property.
Okay, I understand the point of, denotatively what you're saying, but on a connotative basis, and this law, in part is precipitated by a bad actor. And, if you read the papers and you look what's going on, there sounds like it's not an uncommon thing. And as Airbnb becomes more prevalent, you're probably going to there's a chance you get more bad actors. So, the point of what I'm asking is, how does this law, or how does this bylaw, address a bad actor? And let me point out, I think it is section there's a section where you refer to violations, and that with 3 violations. Section 3, is it? Hold on.
Yep.
Gosh, there it is. In the event there are 3 or more violations in a 12-month period, the right to renew registration may be denied by a vote of the Board of Selectmen. For example, you have a random place that has 3 violations, and then it sounds like, the way I read it, and correct me if I'm wrong, in January of the next year, you can choose to deny the renewal of registration. What if this person just moves it from one LLC to another LLC? You cannot then, the way I read it, you can then no longer deny registration.
Which technically is most likely true, but even in a permit case, if we had a permit and revoked it and then they formed a new LLC, you're in the same
Same situation.
situation.
Why can't we, if we're going to revoke a registration in January, why can't we also revoke a registration in August if we see multiple violations?
But once you've
Just saying
exceeded
that December is not when they rent. You want to kind of hurt them.
You're going exactly where I was going. which
Well, I
was-
mean,
you've
the other thing you have
established
to
a hurdle.
remember, there are fines associated. So even if they only do 3, you're talking $600 worth of fines. And for the truly bad apples, quite frankly, they're going to start racking up, and that's per day, per offense. So if you're truly a bad apple, you're probably going to rack up a significant amount of fines. And that should be a deterrent.
Roxanne, I have a quick question. How will you collect them?
How do we collect them?
Well, we'd end up notifying them just like other fines that we have, and then enforcement ends up, like, in the case of fines, by bylaws ends up with we would have to take them to court for an action.
Right.
Right.
Cost some more money.
And if he said to you, I'm not going to pay, bankrupts an LLC and just moves it to another LLC, how do you collect those fines?
You don't.
Right. And this person, into the 2 years, in this particular instance, they've already done that once.
We know.
We're
So,
aware.
so my
This
question
is
to
one of
you
over
becomes-
100, by the way.
I'm sorry?
It's one of over 100. So we're
Right.
talking less than 1%.
Yes, and that's why I asked you, I preceded this by stating that, you know, we have a bad actor. And my question to you is, how does this law address a bad actor? Where are the teeth to this?
Fine. Through the fines and what we're able to do, whether it was permitting or anything else, somebody that's going to continue to change the LLC, put it in new ownership and the rest, who's going to continue to try to play that game. There's only so much that we can do in that
Some
case.
boards do this all the time, as I understand it.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is not a game that is new to Stockbridge. This is one of the challenges of regulating, housing that's rented.
The other thing we have to keep in mind is right now, this is just a draft that's going to the planning board and then town meeting.
Right.
If this is in other communities, these type of bylaws have spent years at town meeting without getting passed,
Yeah.
which then, there's still a chance we may have nothing for short-term rentals.
Right.
This is our first attempt at creating something, putting some fines and forfeitures in there. We would use our legal and enforcement teams to do as much as we can. But in the case of, if somebody wanted to, there's ways around almost any.
And can I ask a question about that? This is Ben Lipson. Earlier in the bylaw, it talks about the owner or the principal for an LLC or a trust. Is there a way to hold the individual accountable? So for example, if it did switch to a different LLC, that we would still know who the person was, or if the person had multiple properties with multiple violations, could we hold that person responsible?
Most likely, and only because I have experienced this quite a bit dealing with some individuals in my previous position, is a lot of times they will form LLCs for each property and just even give them like a number one, whatever Joe's LLC 1, Joe LLC's 2, each one's a legal separate entity. So from the case, from that perspective, it's a different legal owner and the rest. And sometimes it's as easy as just changing who the president is of the LLC and then renaming it, and it's considered a different one.
Yep.
But then they also have to be going through the process of constantly changing their LLC. They're filing for their insurance, their everything else, because it's new ownership. So
Michael,
if somebody truly wants to do it, I don't know if we can stop
could
it.
we consider, instead of finding the owner, finding the primary manager? I'm asking, I just thought of this.
Well, and then what you do is you put potentially just an employee who's
Yeah.
taken a job in good faith, and you're penalizing them instead of the person who's really responsible.
And I don't believe you can.
Okay. Yeah, not all ideas are good ideas.
I mean, the other thing that everyone has to realize too is that there is the possibility also of criminal violations, which obviously, if you're on our radar, then we would probably be watching for that kind of behavior.
And hopefully down the road, because the state kind of just dumped this, legalizing this, and really no codes in the building code stuff. Hopefully down the road that the state steps in and puts some regulations on these Airbnbs, which they should have done in the beginning, but hopefully in the next year, couple of years, that the state steps in and set some guidelines for this, because it is a big thing across the whole state.
And I think Stockbridge should pay attention and support any efforts that short-term rentals get a separate classification, just like bed and breakfast hotels, residential, commercial, the rest. But short-term rentals right now are just lumped in the building and fire code as residential properties. So as long as it's there, that's what we're dealing with.
Right, and
thank
in
you.
here, we've also included under regulations, 2.1C, units that meet the definition of professionally managed units under Mass General Law, Chapter 64G, Section 1. So basically, if they own multiple properties, they fall under that category.
But that also is limited by the whole idea of creating separate LLCs, even if the beneficial owner remains the same.
Yeah, there's still ways around it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there's always a way around everything if you're determined enough. The bottom line is make it as inconvenient and costly by actually going after the fines as possible. And if it becomes too inconvenient, or too costly, then they just may decide to move elsewhere.
No, I understand everything you're saying, and no doubt you all have driven around the town and you might notice a house with dumpsters in front of it, that looks like this. And we in the neighborhood live with it every day. But, starting, about a week ago, the noise started with the partying outside and, the police were called and they were shut down. And basically then the residents were yelling, and I won't use the words, but they were yelling at the neighborhood, basically expressing their thoughts about having been told to go inside. So this is clearly attracting
With the familiar
certain-
trees.
with some colorful words, on a Saturday night, that's just what you want to hear.
Yeah.
So it's something that we in this neighborhood live with. And I know that you are balancing the needs of the town and the needs of the many regarding this. But I guess what I'm asking you for is something with some bite that we can at least take the edge off what's going on here. And that's why I'd like to go to this whole idea of that section 3, where you talk about the violations within a 12-month period, and you are able to deal with it the subsequent year. If there is a way to put an addendum to that, where you state a higher hurdle rate, whether it be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or something as ridiculous as 10 violations, causes an immediate revocation of the right to operate as a short-term rental, and force the changing of the LLC perhaps multiple times a year. And the point of that, Roxanne, as you referred to, is you make it more expensive to continue doing this bad behavior.
That's something the planning board
Well,
can
the
do.
question is whether or not it's legal for us to do so. What's within our ability to do legally?
Well, and
Why would that
technically, we
not be
can move toward a full, you can look at other communities have full permitting, you can have inspections, you can have the whole, but whether or not you can set up that program, the cost of running that program, and then also whether or not the town people would support that program.
Yeah, right.
No, and
Aside from the political considerations, do we need full permitting to be able to revoke a registration upon 5 or 10
yeah, that's the
violations?
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, the question is without doing a full permit,
Right, can we revoke the
can
registration?
we revoke?
Well, I
the
think that's a
registration?
simple legal question. That's a yes or
Yep.
no legal question.
Right,
So I think we could get that one question answered.
Okay.
We could still refer it because the bylaw can be changed because it has to have a public hearing. And at that point, if we have an answer, we can have it there. And then when the planning board resubmits it, that section could be changed.
Well,
If possible. If that's the only one, I don't think we hold up referring
Yeah,
it
we gotta
to the
refer
planning
this.
how
board.
about we put it in and then it's easier to strike it if it's not, if it comes back, it's not legal.
I would rather put it in as we know it's legal
Yeah.
now
You got-
and then make a change
Okay.
based on the concern raised today. At the public hearing,
There'll be
I
concerns
could
at the
attend and
public
say
hearing.
we have looked at one issue that was brought up before we referred it, and we have the following answer as far as
Okay.
revocation.
Yeah, again, I hope you guys understand and feel what we are all dealing with. If you have an idea or something that can put a little bit more teeth to specifically, not everybody, this is something that's going to apply to virtually no one, but might apply to, our situation, something to put some teeth into what we're trying to do. And even if it is just a matter of raising the hurdle, meaning expense to operate in this manner, that is a deterrent.
All right, we're gonna do that, Steve. We're gonna try to get an answer, and if we get the positive answer, we'll at the public hearing add it back in. Is that okay with everyone?
Yeah.
Yeah, one other thing though is I think we should also be asking about, is there any way to stop this whole LLC jumping? If there's any legal way that they know of.
Changing from
Kind of doubt it, but
LLCs and the rest. Yeah, we have talked about that, and it's just also hard. Yeah, it's very difficult to.
That's probably why I wanted to ban them, but it's so many people have them. I understand why that might be onerous, but.
Okay, so,
all right,
Can I make one more comment?
Yeah.
First of all, I again want to thank you all for all the time and effort you put into this. And let's hope that the planning board and the town support it so we can move forward. But just as another specific example, since they're not allowed to have commercial dumpsters, is there a way to get commercial dumpsters removed when they're identified? Or is there a way, if this bylaw passes, hopefully, to alert the companies that supply commercial dumpsters that it's not permissible in Stockbridge?
well, I would believe
That would be
if
the fine.
you can't have a commercial dumpster and they have it, that'll be a daily fine until they remove it.
Yes.
So yeah, they'll be paying $200 or $300 a day every time a dumpster sits there.
yeah, it's a daily fine. It's every day that they're in violation. And I don't think there's anything to prohibit us from contacting the company that's servicing the dumpster to let them know that it is in violation.
Yeah. We have no enforcement over that part. We have enforcement over finding
Yeah.
the
Right.
property
In terms
for
of
violating it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I wasn't thinking of enforcement, but just informing.
Yeah, if they want
companies.
to pay $300 a day, they have to sit there. It's not going to be profitable for them.
I beg to differ there. At $1,000 a night, it will be profitable. And you can only find him a maximum of $300 a day. So he's still netting $700. And if you run the math on what his investment is, it's still a very hefty return. Which is why I
Right.
think
$100 a day is $9,000 a month. That's a pretty big
Right.
It's a
whack.
pretty
Yeah.
big whack.
Simply getting rid of a commercial, say, example of a commercial dumpster, just getting rid of that lifts a fine.
My take is we try this for a year and we see how it goes and we reevaluate it, next, if it passes. And that's the one thing to keep in mind. In surrounding communities, many of these haven't passed. So we got to be careful that we don't overreach because there's going to be some folks who don't want, burdensome regulation on their property. So let's try this, see how we do. If we need to tweak it or-
I have another question in principle, and is it possible for this law to only apply to ownership of short-term rentals from entities or people who do not reside in Stockbridge?
That's illegal.
No, that's
I believe that's
a
illegal.
class of operators.
Right.
You could do that, but
It is, and then
You can make the distinction?
there's a section that you can limit the amount of days. If you remember when we first were discussing this, like, I think it's what was it, 60?
That's not what he's
days
talking
was
about.
Proposed, and then you have to track how many days if they're not.
no, but we don't need to
No,
do that.
that's not what Ben's talking about.
Oh.
He's talking about if someone owns it but doesn't live here.
Right,
We did discuss, and
Right.
that's not legal.
right. We
We can't do that. You can't discriminate
have
and
a-
say, because you live in whatever, because you live in Cambridge and you own a house in Stockbridge, you can't do this. You can't say that.
Yeah, you can do it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you
And
You
we
said-
had two different class of operators in the one I wrote and Don approved it. It was the class of.
Yeah, I think that's
residential- Hold on one
incorrect.
sec, Steve. It's a class of residential owners versus
There's a
non-residential.
whole lot of conversations that go on and I'm getting conflicting information. So
So if I can just, so then you get into, right, it's once again, permitting, you have to enforce, and a lot of communities have difficulty enforcing it because if the owner's out of town, you can restrict the amount of days that they can. I believe the Lennox one has something similar where it's like 60 days or only 90 days out of the year during, or some limit like the season, where if you're not an owner, there are some things, but once again, it becomes enforcement, the ability to pass the rest. We have a number of properties, whether or not somebody lives directly in town or not. It gets into more of regulating. Well, we were creating one right now around trying to enforce.
Right, but so you're saying though, you'd have to,
It might make it easier to pass.
this is not what I remember discussing, because I thought that when it was discussed that, no, you can't make that discrimination because say they live in Lake, they don't live in Stockbridge. So you're saying, yes, you can limit how many days that they could actually rent it if they just happen to live in a nearby town and it makes no difference. Maybe they live in Cambridge, they live in Boston. So only if they live in a different town, you can limit the number of days if you're fully regulating.
We're not talking about.
However, you can't prohibit them. from
Right, you can't prohibit them from doing it.
Exactly. So
And then it wasn't days, was it seasons or, yeah,
No, but we were, look, the MGL 64G, whatever it is, does allow us to define classes of operators. And you could make it so that a class of operator who's a resident in town, none of this applies to them. That might make it easier to pass.
It may not either.
That is, if I can interject for one moment.
that's assuming
my
that everyone
understanding-
here will always be nice.
Yeah, well, I mean, but then you're right, then it undercuts the ability of a local
We
person.
got the option of,
I think we can
That
do this
is next.
now, and then we're gonna have great experience coming out of this to see how well it works. And I think that, that the problem, Steve, is that because it's a zoning bylaw, it has to be referred to the planning board, that's to hold a hearing. So if you want this on the town meeting in June, we gotta get going, or else we're not gonna make that deadline for this season. So, that's kind of what we're up against is the schedule at this point. I think we try this, see how it works, and, we're all open ears if it needs to be revised. If it even passes.
If it
Okay,
passes.
I thought since you are allowed to create a law limiting days for outside owners, that establishes a legal construct of allowing different rules for an outside owner than for a resident.
I believe it does. And that's what that's one of the reasons, one of the things we did is we banned professionally managed operators, which are non-residents who are managing 2 or more units. Those are banned in this bylaw.
Well,
And that is
if he
defined in
so
MGL
if-
64G, whatever it is. Yeah,
takes care of most of
that's
it.
good.
That takes
That's great.
a lot of it.
And it keeps the small one owns a house and rents it out. That's
Right.
great.
That's what we're trying to protect.
Doesn't heavily impact local owners. And the
Okay.
other thing everybody should remember is that it's never really wise to write a bylaw just to address one specific situation. It needs to be applicable across the board.
One last question. Tom LaBelle sent us all a memo. He sent it to me and asked me to forward it, which I took a little grief because I did that. But this is zoning bylaw, and he asked that our zoning bylaws follow the format of the current zoning bylaws.
Yeah.
And does this do that? I don't know. I haven't checked.
Yes.
But I just want to make sure that the lettering and numbering and the Is and the I's follow our current structure, because if we're gonna ask that all our bylaws do that, I think ours should too.
I think they probably do, but they all
Do you
get,
mind just making sure that the subsections and subsections follow the current construct?
well, we're assuming that town council has actually done that.
Oh,
Should have.
I don't know.
She should have.
Yes.
You saw the memo.
Luckily, she did say to keep it right No, they have looked at that, so, yeah.
Okay, so let's pass, I'll make a motion that we pass the bylaw onto the planning board.
Second.
Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.
Make a
Thanks,
motion to
everybody.
Adjourn.
Second.
Second.
Say anything yet? That is all.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.